You've heard AM, you've heard FM. Now, tune into DM Radio, the world's longest running show about data. Each week, host Eric Kavanaugh interviews the brightest minds in the world of information management. Want to be on the show? Send an email to info@dmradio.biz. Now, here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the longest running show in the world about data. It's called DM Radio. Yours truly, Eric Kavanaugh here with a couple old friends. We're very excited to be talking about hybrid cloud and the need for unified analytics. We have the inimitable Paige Roperts online. I've done probably 20 webinars with Paige over the last 20 odd years or so. Time flies when you're having fun. And Eugene Burke, my good friend and stealth business partner from a company called Digital Strategies Group. We're working on some interesting stuff, hopefully a solution for the loss of third-party cookies, but more on that on a future show. Today, we're going to talk about analytics and analytic architectures and all this stuff going on in the cloud. It's very exciting what's in the cloud. If you think about being able to do cloud data warehousing, well, you got several options, right? You've got Snowflake, you've got Amazon Redshift, you've got Databricks, and I actually know a fun story about Amazon Redshift that I read it in Paige's blog she wrote recently about cloud architectures and costs and so forth. And I remember Rick Glick and Barry Zane explaining to me the architecture of a company called Parexel way back in, I guess it was around 2010 maybe, or 2011. I think it was 2010. And it was very interesting. He had worked on what we now understand as push-down capabilities, where you have a database, you have an analytic database. That was what Parexel was designed to be, but he figured out ways to push some of the processing down to lower levels, maybe where the data lives in some other database. And it's a very clever thing to do because you can optimize the architecture, the throughput, the capacity, all these different things if you're very clever about it. And they sure were. Well, eventually they got bought or absorbed, I guess, by Amazon. It's now become what is known as Redshift. Now they have, of course, built additional code on top of that. I'm sure it's not just the original engine, but even back then it was very interesting stuff. And so the point is you've got a lot of options, but you still have a lot of options on-prem too. And, just funny random stories about the business that we're in, Cloudera, right? Cloudera came along and for the longest time, they were just on-prem. I remember old Dr. Robin Bloor with his good sense of humor once joking, "Who put the cloud in Cloudera? No one, and that's the problem." But that was a number of years ago, and they've kind of figured that stuff out.
Good Robin name from imitation.
I can't help myself. He's so much fun to imitate. It's just so interesting. But the point of this show is to get into the details about costs and what is more cost effective. And the bottom line is there are very clever architectures you can put forth that will allow you to leverage on-prem capabilities and whatever you have in the cloud, but you've got to be able to govern and manage that. You need transparency, you need to see what's going on. These are the questions that we're going to throw at our guests today. With that, I'll throw it over to Paige Roperts. Paige, tell us a bit about yourself and talk about this blog that you wrote and this whole disincentive concept, which I thought was pretty compelling. Tell us what that's all about.
Well, you were naming options that you had, and you totally skipped. So Vertica is where I've been working for about the last 5 years, and they've got a really cool database that is now owned by OpenText. It's in the AI Aviator platform, and you can go anywhere with it, on-prem, on cloud, on any cloud, private cloud, whatever. So
yeah, I wanted to give you the ability.
you wanted me to introduce it. I see how you are. But now the blog you were talking about is something that occurred to me at some point, and doesn't have anything to do with anything except that I just went, whoa, wait a minute. So I've been in the database and data management field for like 25 years, and all along we had this mindset of, we have to be faster. Performance matters. We have to be efficient. We have to take whatever hardware we have and just really use it to the max because our competitors will, and we want to be better than them. And that's always been true for every single technology I've ever worked on. And now it is not. And that was the thing that occurred to me. is if you are a Snowflake or a Redshift or, whoever is you're on this cloud. And if you're Redshift, then you're selling Amazon Cloud Compute and you're selling the software. So Amazon is selling both of those. So if the software uses more compute, they make more money.
Right.
Snowflake is kind of the same way. They're on multiple clouds, but each one they make a deal to get their compute very cheaply, and then they sell it back to the customer at a high markup, so that when you buy Snowflake, you're getting the software and you're getting the compute hardware underneath, and you're paying a lot of money. And when they auto scale, they auto increase your budget, whether you want them to or not. And if tomorrow their engineers figured out a way to be twice as efficient on the hardware, Snowflake would lose money. They have a counter incentive for their engineers to do the right thing and really use the compute hardware to its max.
Right.
Their incentive is actually to sell you more hardware. You pay for only what you use, so you better use more because we want to make money. So that is a very backward way of from what I'm used to. So.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I should point out at the opening of the show, I was just listing the cloud database, the cloud data warehouse, like the sort of pure play cloud data warehouse companies, which are basically Snowflake and Redshift and Databricks. And then there are other venerable companies like Vertica. And I've talked about this on our show many times over the years. Dr. Michael Stonebreaker, he's the guy who helped launch this company way back at the beginning of time, right?
Well, the thing of it is, Databricks and Vertica came out about the same time. If anything, Databricks was before some of Vertica, and they are both cloud and on-prem. They are one that can go in multiple places. Now they have a deal going with I think Microsoft Azure, so that some of their stuff is partnered with Azure and you can get it there. But the Databricks platform works fine on-prem. I mean, a lot of good platforms have been, are in both places, and and I think that whole, Vertica is venerable thing is one of the things I've been fighting, because this software has recently become old enough to vote. If it were a person. And yet a lot of people have it sort of pigeonholed in their brain as this old data warehouse that we had 30 years ago, and it's like we didn't even exist then. It's that Michael Stonebreaker brilliance of everything should be columnar if you're going to do analytics was not that long ago. And Vertica was one of the pioneers of being able to do that. Not the first, but one of the first. And then nowadays, everybody's followed along. I mean, you see Parquet and Orc and all of those guys are columnar. Anybody who does analytics, they've figured out it's faster if you organize your data that way. So it's kind of a misnomer. You are not the only person to make that mistake. I hear it a lot.
That's interesting. I guess 05 is when I interviewed Dr. Stonebreaker, and I didn't realize that Databricks was that old. 2013 apparently is when they.
So Vertica is about 5 years older. We actually 05 is when they really got going. 07 is when version 1 was launched.
Very interesting. Look at that. Yeah, cool stuff.
You're Googling it, aren't you?
Yeah, I did. I have to go to Google it without question. Google's still out there, Google
Google Cloud is one of those that, I mean, Google BigQuery is one of those cloud ones that's definitely in the game.
Well, and this is so it brings up an interesting point to discuss, which is architecture. And of course, you know a lot about architecture and analytics architecture. And there's in that article you wrote, you quote a CTO, I think, who has said they went back to on-prem from being up in the cloud and said that I could rebuy the hardware every 3 months for the cost that I'm paying in the cloud. Would you mind explaining a little bit to our audience out there why that is? Like, why is it that this company got up into the cloud and then the costs were vastly higher than they thought they were going to be? to the point where the CTO said, whoa, stop, like, let's get back into
Bad
action.
idea. Well, and I
Could you explain
think
that?
this is actually becoming fairly common. There's, I think the last survey said, well, it depends on the survey that you look at. It's somewhere between 60 and 90% of companies out there have found that certain workloads are just don't make sense on the cloud. They've pulled them back. And hybrid, using some things on the cloud and some things on-prem, maybe even some things on different clouds, that's becoming the way to the future. That's the way a lot of people are kind of going. But I think Eugene and I had a conversation before we started the recording about architecture, because a lot of times when people move from on-prem to cloud or from one cloud to another, they do this lift and shift thing. It's like,
Yeah.
let me just take what I have and put it somewhere else. And magically it's going to be better. And if you're going from on-prem to cloud and you didn't re-architect for the cloud, it's going to bite you in the butt. That's not a good way to do it, for a lot of different reasons, if for nothing else, because it really does, it's very disruptive to your business. But also, the cloud has different requirements. There's a different way to do everything. I talked about, it's like if you have a long running query and you're on-prem, doesn't matter. That query takes 2 or 3 days to finish. It's fine. Just let it run in the background until it's done. You do that on the cloud, and that you're paying for 2 or 3 days worth of infrastructure, and that's crazy expensive. It doesn't matter on-prem; it matters on the cloud. Also, there's just the simple fact that I get on the cloud because it's easier. It's easy. The barriers to me using the cloud software are less. Well, if using analytics is easier, what am I going to do? I'm going to use more analytics. That's pretty natural. And in fact, that's one of, in some cases, the advantages, is because more people in your business use it because it's easier to do. But that, you gotta keep that in mind with your budget. If more people are using it, if it's more expensive, that whole pay for only what you use matters.
Right.
If you use a lot, then you're paying a lot. And that's one of those things that people kind of go, this workload worked fine on-prem, but it's not ideal for the cloud. Maybe I should have some workloads on-prem and some workloads on the cloud. That's why you get that hybrid model. Now, the difficulty of that is, of course, if I have Amazon Redshift and it only works on the Amazon cloud, and I really want to be on Azure, or I really want to work on-prem, or I really want to do both, I can't. I have to have multiple technologies to do that. And I think that's one of the advantages that Vertica has had over the years, is because people want to be in multiple places. People want to have one license and put it wherever they want to and move it next year because this didn't make sense here. I wanted to put it over there. You can do that with Vertica. You can't necessarily do that if you have Azure, in Synapse or something like that.
Yeah, so you bring up a really good point here, which is egress. And that's how the cloud vendors tend to get you, right? I always think about this concept of Hotel California, right? You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave, at least without paying a big fee. And that's what keeps people in. That's what keeps you in the cloud, is fear of just paying this painful egress fee. And I haven't really seen much movement away from that model. So all the major cloud vendors that I know of at this point do tag you with egress fees if you leave. And that's the scary thing, right? Because from a CFO's perspective, from any, budgetary perspective, that's a very painful reality. You just pay a whole bunch of money to get your data back. I mean,
Yeah, it's your data. How come I have to pay you to get it?
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of a death by 1,000 cuts by Apple. I'll take a pot shot at Apple because I just get these bills coming through, and I'm like, where is this coming from? I can't even find it inside I had to call the customer service lady to get to the bottom of it, and it took like an hour and a half just to stop the hemorrhaging. I'm like, please make it go away. And these are real considerations when you get up into the cloud. As you suggest, it starts off easy, but then you're kind of stuck there. And you want to use these credits that you've bought, but you don't want to go over, and it just becomes kind of an interesting thing to manage. But
I want to quote Admiral Akbar: "It's a trap." It's like, because it's so easy to get in and so
Right.
hard to get out.
Yeah.
I think for many years, people looked at, technologies as, the lock-in was a bad thing. And
Right.
people were trying to avoid it so hard. And now they're like rushing, let's go get in this cloud. Well, they have an egress fee if we want to get off. And they have, all these, this, are you sure you want to do that? It's too late. You already did it. Now,
Right.
if you want to change your mind and you go, oh, wow, this was really not the best idea, maybe I should go somewhere else. It's really hard now. And it's going to cost you money. And it's not simple. And I think, I honestly think the egress fees are the biggest. They make me angry. I think they're just like, hi, I'm gonna lock you in and I'm even gonna tell you about it and you're just gonna like it because you don't have any alternative.
Right.
It's just really mean. It's really not the way data was meant to flow. I mean,
That's interesting.
my whole life, it's like data flows. And as architects, when you're building that, you always want to keep your options open. Stuff changes. I mean, the conditions 5 years ago are completely different from the conditions now. And I'd be crazy to think that the conditions 5 years from now are going to be the same as now. I mean, they just aren't. That's the world changes, and the needs of my data architecture are going to change. And I'd really like to have my options to be able
Right.
to go somewhere else if I want to.
Yeah.
Um, and that egress fee and all the barriers to being able to move. I mean, I think again, the survey I read is 80% of companies now are multi-cloud.
Wow.
Well, if I'm in 2 or 3 different clouds and I want to move my data back and forth, pretty much. I mean, that's what you want to do.
Right.
And every time I move it from one cloud to the other, I got to pay an egress fee. That's yeah. I kind of wish somebody would. I mean, a whole lot of people would just go up to the cloud providers and say, "This is not cool.
Yeah.
Stop this."
Well,
I
so
actually had someone defend it in one of the
yeah.
classes I did at DBTA.
Oh no.
One guy, everybody else was like, yeah, egress fees, they're terrible. And one guy was like, well, it costs them money to move the data around, and it's reasonable for them to charge a fee. And I'm like, then why don't they charge you a fee when you're putting data in?
Yeah.
They
Right.
don't. Because they want you to do that. They just don't want you to take the data out.
Right.
You can check
No.
out anytime you like, but you can never egress.
That's it. You got it.
That's exactly right. Well, and options are what you need in the world going forward. And so we're talking with Paige Roperts of OpenText, Vertica, and Eugene Burke. We're going to be going on a commercial break here in just a second, but options are crucial for agility, and we want to talk about that in the next segment. And as Paige has described, if you go down this road with Vertica, you're going to have the agility to use whichever cloud you want, however you want, without having to pay those egress fees. We'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio.
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, folks, back here on a very special DM Radio with Paige Roperts of Vertica by OpenText these days, and Eugene Burke of Digital Strategies Group. We've been talking about analytics and hybrid analytic architectures and the fact that hybrid is here to stay. And we closed off the last segment really talking about the importance of agility. And that's what CTOs and CIOs and CDOs want. No one wants to be locked down to one particular option. And these egress fees that you get from the cloud vendors, from really all the major cloud vendors that I know of, are very painful. And so that's why it's difficult. And that's why you have to be very careful about how you design your environment. And remember that things are changing. And, hopefully in this show, we'll get time to talk maybe in the podcast bonus segment about large language models and how they're going to be impacting the manner in which we interact with our data. But still, underneath somewhere, you're going to want to be using some kind of analytic engine, and you want that sucker to be fast, and you want it to be columnar, almost assuredly. Everyone's going down that road these days, and that came from Dr. Michael Stonebreaker way back in 2005. I interviewed him via TDWI, and his whole pitch back then was one size does not fit all. And I was like, well, what do you mean by that? And he says, well, the whole world has gone with relational databases, but relational databases are not good for every use case. And they're certainly not good as columnar-oriented databases are. because it's easier to compress the columns and because it's cleaner, because everything in that column should be the same. And if it's not, you probably have an issue, a data quality issue to address. But anyway, you have to be careful and figure out which workloads are good for on-prem, which workloads are good in the cloud, and how can you orchestrate a multi-cloud environment. And I'll throw it over to Eugene Burke of Digital Strategies Group, who has wrangled with this in the past, right, Eugene? You've seen what happens when companies go into the cloud and go, oh no, and they get
Yes,
out. Tell us
I
about
have.
that and go ahead.
So, Paige, you made a really good point in the last segment about some workloads are fine where they are. And when you get those workloads in the cloud, there are things that you didn't know that you didn't know. And all of a sudden, you're buying your hardware every quarter. And so what are some of those for the technical architects or the CTOs who have, it's not that they've drunk the Kool-Aid, it's just there are a lot of compelling reasons in terms of elastic compute and RAM. The ability to do huge workloads is very attractive, but there are some workloads that are perfectly fine where they are. What are some of the guidelines that you've come up with to say this one is fine where it is?
I think part of I feel like we've been dunking on clouds a lot. And clouds are awesome. If you want to do an elastic workload that's spiky, cloud is the ideal place to do that.
Okay.
In most cases, that's the case. If you have a nice steady workload where it's pretty much the same workload all the time, maybe you have slow growth, that kind of thing, moving that to the cloud is just not the best option.
Yeah, I agree.
It makes a lot of sense to keep that right where it is, or even, I mean, and this is the other thing, is some data is born in the cloud and some data is born on-prem. And if it's born on the cloud, then of course you've got to move it to get it on-prem. If it's born on-prem, you got to move it to get it to the cloud. Sometimes it makes sense to put your analytics wherever your data is. And that is another thing. It's like you have that gravity of, if I got a petabyte of data sitting in my data center, the last thing I want to do is have to move that to the cloud to do analytics on it. That's silly. I should just move the analytics to where my data is. On the other hand, if I got that same amount of data sitting on a cloud, moving it to on-prem makes no sense at all. So there's two aspects right there. One, really spiky workloads, and the other is workloads with data that it's born on the cloud. Those are both things that should be on the cloud, that make sense on the cloud, that you should do on the cloud. Now, I love to tell stories because I think it really brings it to you to reality. So there was a large telco, and the data architect is kind of somebody we know, and they used an old school, I think it was Teradata, and they had multiple data warehouses all over, all these different divisions. Everybody was doing their own thing. It was costing them about 16.7 million a year to do all of that analytics for the whole company. They were like, we can do better than this. So this is one of the options that I don't think a lot of people think about. They realize that the load is spiky, but it's spiky for individual departments. It's not going to all spike at the same time. So what they did is built one private cloud. I think they used Pure Storage hardware, which gives you S3, basically cloud compatible you can put cloud compatible software on it, and then essentially have a multi-tenant cloud kind of situation inside your own company. And that was really powerful for them. And they knocked their costs down to 2.5 million a year. And we're knocking out their analytics faster and more efficiently that way. Well, that's great. Then along came a Snowflake exec and took one of their execs out golfing. And the next thing you know, they had a mandate. They had to move all that to Snowflake in the cloud. And now they do that. And it costs them 42 million a year to do exactly the same thing that they were doing before. And I was like, so this is a good example of where it's like cloud, just because it's the fashion, is not the ideal place to put every workload. You just you can't listen to what's cool today and do that. I mean, if I'd listened to that 7 years ago, if everybody listened to that, they'd all have Hadoop clusters. I mean, everything it goes through waves, it goes through fashions, and you just got to kind of really evaluate what makes sense for you.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. What I would add, a couple of things. So in our analysis, in looking at analytic workloads and getting the answer to the analyst, the executive, the manager, what is the difference between getting that answer to that person at 8 a.m. in the morning, right, versus 12 p.m., right? Is there a big difference? Now, in some businesses, that time, that decision lag is critical. And so you're going to spend the money to not get them that answer to that person by 8 a.m., but you're going to get the answer to that person by 6 a.m., right? And so, especially in finance, right? So we were customers of yours at Bank of New York Mellon.
Mhm.
And one of the challenges that we solved was having a huge private data lake because we were one of those GSIB banks, and we needed to be able to build a private cloud to do all of our analytics within the four walls and keep the Fed happy. But we needed that scalability. And so those were things that pointed us down that direction of, well, cloud is not really an option for us.
Yeah.
And we don't have that driving need for the elasticity. We have kind of a steady state demand with occasional spikes. And so there wasn't that driver for, okay, go into the cloud. Now, if they went all Snowflake, does that mean that they provided the benefit of analytics and people were able to make more advantageous business decisions as a result? They didn't do the analysis of the business value of the data in place at decision ready, and that's that next level of value engineering that a lot of companies are just waking up to.
Well, I think in
Thoughts?
your case, it was pure politics. I know the data
course.
architect was the
Golf.
one who supplied me
It
with
was
the numbers,
golf.
and then on the anonymous condition, and he was just like, I am so unhappy with this. It's like I built this beautiful system that worked perfectly, and they trashed it and went to the cloud, and now it's costing them huge amounts of money. But it was a political decision. It's like
Yeah.
in a lot of cases, it's like you can't fight that if you're the architect. It's like you just gotta go with it and do the best you can in that situation.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think you hit on a couple of other things that I hadn't thought of. The cloud is pretty secure. I mean, nowadays public clouds are pretty solid. They're probably better than most people's data centers as far as security. But a lot of the regulations say you can't go to the cloud. You've got people's financial data, you can't go to the cloud. You got to do it inside. But you want to get that sort of a lot of the advantages of cloud. That's where I see private cloud a lot. I see guys like Fast and Scalaility and Pure, and a lot of those folks that are giving you S3 compatible capabilities on-prem are doing it purely so people can build their own internal clouds for large companies.
It was fashionable to close down data centers about 6-7 years ago, that CIOs were competing one with another to see if, how many data centers they could exit out of and take that cost off of their budget. And it was pure fad, right?
Yes.
Pure fad.
Well, and they're taking that CapEx off of their budget, and they're switching it over to OpEx instead. So now it's an operating expense, and maybe it's more, but if I got to pay $100 now, or I got to pay you $10 a month for a year, I'm going to think $10 a month sounds much better, even if I'm paying you, $120 this year, and then another $120 next year, and then another 120. So I was like, I'm astronomically more paying, but it doesn't hurt as much. And I think that is one of the things that people see when they're going to the cloud.
So workloads, we talked about if it's spiky, if it needs that instantaneous elasticity, that's ideal for the cloud. Any other kind of big guidelines that you would go for?
We had a company, there was a customer years back. They were a small startup, and they grew like mad. They doubled 50 times in 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
I cannot imagine how hard that would have been if they had been on-prem.
True.
That would have been virtually impossible for them to do. The IT infrastructure would have stopped them from growing like that.
Mm-hmm.
Which, of course, as a startup, that's gold. You want that. And being able to go from small to huge in a short amount of time, that was a big thing for them, and cloud made it possible. So I think cloud has huge advantages. And I just think the problem is that everybody hears pay for only what you use, and they think cost savings is the big advantage of going to cloud, and they're wrong. That's not it. That's not what you get.
You're right. And we have been kind of dunking on cloud because it's the other side of the coin, and people, it was very easy to be, I'll say, seduced. It was very easy to say, wow, I can have, this many cores, and I can have this much, I can do this big analytic job that, takes 3 days or a day and a half. And I'm, my window is shrinking and I can just get it done. That's compelling, but there are the financial analysis discipline amongst technical architects and CDOs and CIOs. That's where probably we need to sharpen our pencils more to understand what's the difference between, ordering, racking and stacking and planning for that capital expense acquisition pattern as we grow versus, going shopping at the local cloud where the egress, that's how they make their money, right? And it's not.
Well,
it's not
I think it's how they make sure that nobody leaves. It's how they keep customers even if they're unhappy.
Yes.
And it's lock-in. It's old school lock-in, and we just call it egress fees now. We call it other things. It's like, oh look, I'm using 4 Amazon services. Oh great, if I move to Azure, what am I going to do? Well,
back to Eric's question or point about agility. There are now a lot of companies that are like more than multi-cloud. They're everywhere, right?
Hybrid,
based on
cloud.
what GCP does well versus what Azure does well versus what AWS does well. Okay, well, are you moving data amongst 3 different clouds? And there are solution providers that help you architect and comply with all the different regulatory compliance things for the data moving among clouds. Which, if you're paying for data that was born on-prem, that went to GCP, that you extracted to do analytics on Azure, that you're putting in websites on AWS, why are you doing that?
Why are you doing that? Yes, that would be the first question. And the second question is, how much did it cost you just to get your data from here to there?
How much is every hop? And I once asked architects on one of my teams to what is it going to cost? They couldn't come up with the answer because they had never done the engineering analysis down to that level.
Well, and it's not just the engineering analysis. You keep quoting the Catch Media CTO. One of the things that he did was he showed me his Amazon bill. It was 30 pages easily. And each little section would expand into like 50 different line items. And it's like, I had no idea. He had no idea. It's like, where is my money going? I don't know. It's somewhere in one of these 5,000 line items that I'm looking at. It's like, transparency was just not a thing.
We'll pick this up after the break. Phone stuff. You're listening to DM Radio.
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, folks, back here on DM Radio. What a fun show with Paige Roperts, veteran of the analytics industry with OpenText Vertica these days. And Vertica for a long time now, and you guys have kind of bounced around, but you seem to have a nice home now at OpenText. And there's a lot of other stuff. And really the magic of these technologies comes into play when you weave them into other technologies. And of course, OpenText has a lot of other stuff out there. I'm sure that was one of the reasons why they saw an opportunity to grab Vertica and bring it into the mix. And you're kind of seeing this amongst the bigger players, which I think is probably a good direction to go, is they're trying to round out their stack and be able to be almost all things to almost all of their biggest clients, if you will. And that's something where, again, from an analytics perspective, Vertica can be the beating heart and connect to all these other environments and feed them that analytics. They talk about reverse ETL, we talk about reverse insight, if you will. Like the insight happens inside of technology like Vertica, and then you want to patch that into your operational systems across the board. That is when you've closed the loop. That's when you're doing really good business in the analytics space. But we do have a couple fun stories here. And Eugene, you've got a story about the batch windows shortening, or the analytics windows shortening and getting to the point where it was like more than 24 hours, which is more than a day. even on leap year. But go ahead.
Exactly. So mission critical cube on-prem was 22 hours. 2 months later, it was 24 hours. 2 months later, it was 27 hours. And it's something that the business uses for pricing calculation and a bunch of other things. And it's one of those analytics services that kind of, it acquired a whole bunch of use cases and users and then data, and then it became unwieldy. And so unraveling that and putting that in the cloud became a really attractive pathway to kind of get us out of this Gordian knot of the ever disappearing processing window.
The Gordian knot. And I guess you've got a story of someone who figured that out. Is that right, Paige, of how to do it correctly?
Well, yeah, I mean, we have folks that went from like daily pricing, which is what you're talking, to hourly pricing. But I think one of the things that, so how much data were you guys dealing with, about just general?
Probably about 15 to 20 tera.
Terabytes? 15 to 20 terabytes. Okay. So I'm going to give you an example. So I actually, as a like side job, I actually write books for O'Reilly, and I'm helping out the Aerospike folks. And they have a really super unbelievably fast transactional database that does about 10 million ad transactions per second, ad auctions per second for the trade desk, which is one of their biggest customers. And it is also one of Vertica's biggest customers, because they take that 10 million ad auctions per second worth of data, throw it into our database, and then they generate about 40,000 reports a day. And they do it all on the Amazon cloud. Now, the thing about doing that is they have to keep their window as narrow as possible, because they're spinning up a whole lot of compute and paying for it for as long as it's up. So they've narrowed their window down to 6 hours. It's like, so they spin it up, generate 40,000 reports, spin it back down in less than 6 hours. And I think that is an example of what can be done. And I'm not going to say it can be done on the cloud, because they are looking at doing the exact same thing on-prem. They also have their high availability backup is on-prem, and they have another one over because some of their customers don't like Amazon. They have a smaller capability over on Azure.
Wow.
That is, I think, where companies are going. It's like they just figure out the fastest, best way they can do it, regardless of platform. And then, over time, if this platform proves better than that one, they're going to move. Yeah. Because for them, the speed is just that important. And I think it's just, like you said, it's a re-architecture thing. And I think you mentioned cubes, and that right off I'm like, that's part of the problem. Because one of the things that Vertica does is it stores all of its data, not as most relational databases are trying to optimize storage space, so they don't want to duplicate data. So they store them in these like star and snowflake schemas and things like that, where it's like there's this data, and in order to do any analytics, I have to join a bunch of things and then sort them, and these are all compute intensive capabilities. What Vertica does is, as you load the data in, it does all the sorting, it does all the joining, it does it. If you need 25 columns to answer a common query, we'll store those 25 columns together, already sorted, ready to go. So when you go to do that query, it's quick. And you may store it also over here. 8 of those columns duplicated in a different structure, because this other query needs those 8 columns, and it needs them aggregated by month or something. And that, and it'll pre-aggregate them so that when you go to do the query, it's quick. And that's, I think it's the latency of moving it from query time when I'm waiting on it to load time when I'm not necessarily waiting on it. So I put all the burden on the load instead of on the query.
Yeah, you're bringing up a really good point here, and I feel bad that we're running out of time because we're getting into some good material here. But, I did a webinar on Monday with your colleague, Steve Sarsfield, and I was kind of laying out what's happening in the so-called modern data stack. And really what's happened is in the modern data stack, you have every component of a good database carved out and run as a separate entity. Now, that's good for a number of reasons, for elasticity of a particular component like storage or integration or processing or AI, ML, et cetera. But it does get complex, and we also sacrificed state at the altar of scale, as I like to say. And the fact is that for many use cases, you can do all these things. So I listed storage, integration, processing, analytics, orchestration, semantics, governance, AI, ML, and security. You could do all that stuff in a single database.
One place.
And if it's fast enough and powerful enough, then you want to do all that stuff in a single database. You don't want to be moving around from place to place, because every time you go from one object to another object in any of these flow charts, there is a chance for something to get messed up. And you see that. And like, just as a funny side story, I'm out here in Wimberley, Texas, and just horrible internet. And I'm trying to use the Google machine. And I'm learning about their architecture because of how slowly it loads the page. And what happens if you don't get the page loaded fast enough is when you hit enter, it won't search for the query. It just goes enter inside the search box. I'm like, I don't want enter inside the search box. I want to get the query done. But the reason that happens, I will bet you, is because of just how dynamically these pages are built these days by companies like Google, because they have these architectures that are very complex. But when it slows down, it's very unpleasant. But Paige, I just wanted to throw that over to you to kind of finish off the live section here. For many, many, many use cases, you don't need the modern data stack. You don't need all this additional complexity. You just need your data to be organized properly in one place with all the functionality required. But what do you think? Go ahead.
That's certainly, and that's why the trade desk uses it as essentially a gigantic data warehouse. But we have a lot of people that are, you talk about the modern data stack, and what you're really talking about is essentially a data lake house. And we totally do that. And there's no reason why you can't. What we see a lot of times is people will leave stuff in their S3 bucket or their, whatever their data lake is in, HDFS or, Google Cloud Storage or whatever, and then, and just query it with Vertica, because we have that query engine capability. We could just do that. Or nowadays, you've got that Iceberg metadata layer, and we can go through there, and that's cool. So one of, this is a little faster if I just go directly, but, and of course, if I put it if I move the data into my own format, then it's going to be super fast. So if I really need that speed, I'm going to do that. If I just need to query it every now and then, I'm going to leave it where it is. And the nice thing about that Iceberg layer of the metadata means that I can query it, I can change it, and this other guy can come in and he can do that too. Maybe I've got a Spark thing over here. He wants to do that. Maybe Snowflake. Maybe some other department has Snowflake and they want to query that data every now and then. That's cool, because I've got that one metadata layer that we're all going through, and that makes it open. And I think that's the difference, is you put it in different places because you need speed.
Mm-hmm.
And then, the nice thing about that stack that allows it, I had an argument with Tony Bear. It's like, oh, Iceberg makes a data lake house. And I'm like, no, Iceberg makes a data lake house open.
Mm-hmm.
Because we had acid on data lakes back in the Hive days, way back. That's not new. What's new is the ability for multiple query engines to go after the same data, change it, and still keep track of it all.
That's right. Right. Which gives you agility, which gives you the capacity, as you suggest, to let other people come and play in your environment as well. Well, folks, the podcast bonus segment is coming up next here on DM Radio. We're talking to Paige Roperts of OpenText Vertica and Eugene Burke of Digital Strategies Group. Wow, what a fun conversation right here on DM Radio.